shoes. Oh, well, the weekend was too short, but I can't choose. When the Lord made the working girl, he made the blues. Well, I'm tired of working my life away and giving somebody else all of my pay while they get rich on the profits that I lose and leaving me here with the working girl blues. Working girl blues, and I can't even afford a new pair of shoes while they can live in any old penthouse they choose. And all that I've got is the working girl blues. My boss said a raise is due most any day, but I wonder, will my hair be all turned gray before he turns that dollar loose and I get my dues and lose a little bit of these working girl blues. I said I'm tired of working my life away and giving somebody else all of my pay while they get rich on the profits that I lose and leaving me here with the working girl blues. Working girl blues, and I can't even afford a new pair of shoes while they can live in any old penthouse they choose. And all that I've got is the working girl blues.
I'm going to talk about a magazine called Working Woman, which has been in existence since about 1979. And I was going to start by comparing two covers of the recent issues of a magazine called Working Woman, Working Mother, and Working Woman. This is a McCall's magazine and seems to address the woman who rather unwillingly goes to work and who needs lots of tips about how to juggle what she really likes to do best, which is mothering, with the fact that in this age she has to do some work. This, which is the magazine that we're going to look at, and you notice that it plays off a relationship between the father and the daughter, and this is clearly about mothers and daughters. This is a magazine addressing a managerial, very ambitious, well on her way to success businesswoman. And as far as I can tell, there's very little talk about private life at all in this magazine. This magazine suggests that what you need to know is how to enter the man's world of business. Before I talk about this, for a minute, I want to say what was most surprising to me about this magazine was that I felt as though the two most important things that feminism had raised in the 60s for women were completely ignored by this journal. One, the issue of how to critically look at women's history, women's relationship to work, women's place in the family, the extent to which Hollywood films have, in fact, belittled women who work, really questions around what would be called ideology. That's one aspect of the women's, I think, very critical aspect of the women's movement, which is ignored by this journal. And the other is the aspect of feminism which has looked at the validity of women's experience and the validity of women's culture. The fact that women have, however, not been the makers of history, have in fact written together, spoken together, made lots and lots of crafts and artistic products together, and have in fact a kind of a community and a sense of community from which perhaps men themselves may learn something. So it seems to me that those two dimensions of feminism have been successfully or not successfully obliterated in a journal like this. And it sort of worries me, because it seems to me that this is very much the result of a new feminist movement, that there is this attention now to a magazine, and it's a very successful magazine. The statistics tell us that Fortune has a base circulation of 670,000, and Working Woman has a circulation of 500,000. I think that's a very successful magazine, and certainly one of the few which addresses the businesswoman with at least as serious a look as Fortune or Forbes does. What I want to look at closely in this magazine are the ways in which the language, the imagery, the editorial position seem to suggest that the only thing that really matters is this male world of success and how to get to the top and how to be a corporate woman. And I think, just to begin briefly, the editorial page today begins with, I think, a kind of characteristic gesture by the editor, a woman called Kate Rand Lloyd. She starts, "Gulp, here comes another new year, and I am as usual fresh out of resolutions." She continues in that vein of sort of what I thought would be sort of silly woman kind of talk, the worst sort that I would expect to see in some of the other kinds of women's magazines. And then as the editorial continues, she begins to tighten up on her language until finally she gets to really what the core of the message is, which is the name of the game. Women have moved ahead at a good clip in 1982, more women in the workforce, more women in higher job levels, more women in non-traditional fields, more women owning their own businesses, and in sight, much, much more, as the commercials say. And she begins the next paragraph. To kick off 1983, women working need, in addition to resolution, a profound and pervasive awareness of how important they have become, and so on. And the language is filled with football rhetoric, with winning the game, with being on the winning team, with success, with a kind of, I think, a very conscious abandonment of how women have often talked, which is in a sort of gossipy, small talk way. This is an attempt to, in many ways, I think, sound like men who are interested in winning and so on. It worries me because it seems to me that, as I said, it's the leaving behind of some of the most important aspects of feminism. I thought I'd just look closely at a couple of other pieces in here. One thing I want to say about the format is that this is a magazine that's very non-visual compared to most of the magazines that are made for women. There are very few, comparatively few articles that are illustrated. Even the ads, there are a few ads that you'd sort of expect to see regular kind of women's ads with cosmetics and so on. But in general, the format of the magazine is a very business-like format. It has a tendency to look sort of black and white and businessy in the way it lays out the text. There's lots and lots of statistics in it. There's lots and lots of very sort of hardcore how-to columns, Working Woman Award. There's lots of attention given. And here I'll just take a look at this page called Getting Ahead, which is written by a woman who answers the questions of women who submit complaints and problems. This is submitted by, there's a question by a woman who's attempting to be a journalist and who's been very badly treated in her job, and she says, "I'm looking elsewhere for a job in journalism, preferably on a paper with a union." She's told systematically by this expert Betty Lehan Harrigan, that she has misunderstood the problem completely, and that what she needs to do is to assess the situation. It sounds very much like a sort of take a survey before you be angry, before you try to do something about this, before you organize a union. Take a survey and try to assess exactly what do other women get in your position, what do other people in your position get, what are the salary bases, and so on. She actually seems to be suggesting that this woman do a research paper before she get in touch with what kinds of changes or complaints she might want to make. The prime villain in your mind seems to be the company itself, she says. You act as if they're all conspiring to prevent you from getting the increase you deserve because you work hard. To me, that's the father's voice. That's the voice that says to women, you have nothing to complain about, you're flying off the handle, you're jumping to conclusions. What you really need to do is a little more research on what's really wrong before you make these rash accusations. And she then goes on to sort of cool out this woman who's suggested that there might be some actual institutional problems, and tells her to face facts, and face facts is an appropriate way to talk about it because this magazine is filled with the value of facts, with the value of fact gathering, with the value of information. It passes on a volley of stuff about books that come out, articles that are written in other journals, about things like Get That Job, How to Succeed in a Job Search, How to Survive Getting Fired, the Termination Handbook, Unemployment Benefits Handbook, and so on. It's a very heavily focused on the sort of new business of the businesswoman, and how many aspects of media, one wonders how many new magazines seem to be fitting into this, seem to be addressing themselves to this kind of woman. We're going to show a short film now, which will be, I think, in harsh contrast to the kind of things I've been talking about and to what's evident in this magazine. And I think it's another comment on what this magazine does not include. In its focus on the professional woman, it's very clear that it's not interested in secretarial, white collar, and really the whole experience of office community and office kind of work. So we'll look at a film now that will somehow, I think, raise a lot of the questions that are pushed underground in a magazine like Working Woman.
At first, it's like a new toy, okay? Everybody's excited, everybody plays with it, but once you're on it, and once you're steadily putting in copy or whatever you're doing on it for 2-3 hours, it can be annoying. Your eyes, your head, fatigue, tiredness.
I did have eye strain because I was working for approximately 6 hours a day at the machine. They were irritated, very red. I couldn't read very well, and they hurt.
Well, my eyes certainly have deteriorated in 7 years of using them, and I suspect that that's probably a cause.
My eyes, I noticed last year, weren't too good, and I usually don't have eyeglass until every 2 years, but now I've been going every 1 year. You know, within 1 year, I've been going. My eyes have changed.
5 years ago, I went to an eye doctor in a panic and said, you know, my eyes hurt all the time. I can't watch television when I go home at night. And he said there was nothing wrong. About 6 months ago, I went back and he said, oh, yes, you need special glasses for your job. I said, why didn't you tell me that 5 years ago? He said, we didn't know anything about it then.
I wore contact lenses, and I discovered I could no longer wear my contact lenses at work, working on the VDTs. I would put my contact lenses in at 8 o'clock in the morning. By 11 o'clock, my eyes were so dry, I couldn't keep them in. I mean, they were just pain.
My problem was I began to feel irritated more than anything else.
One lady that I told you about, she has a headache every night when she leaves. Every night.
Well, as I say, I noticed the backaches of just the physical strain of sitting on the machine. And then I noticed, and I couldn't prove it, I noticed that workers were more quarrelsome, more apt to bicker, more personality conflicts. And I said, this has to do with the work. It can't possibly be that 12 people hired at random from outside, brought into a company on the same time, the same day, could all happen to have short tempers.
Out walking one fine summer's morning, the birds in the branches, they did gaily sing. The lads and the lasses together were sporting, going down to the factory, their work to begin. I spied a fair damsel, far fairer than any, her cheeks like the red rose that none could excel, her skin like the lily that grows in yon valley. She's my own body, Annie, my factory girl. I stepped it up to her, just thinking to view her. But at me she cast a proud look of disdain, saying, "Stand, lovely young man, and do not insult me, for although I am poor, sure I think it no shame. It's not to insult you, fair maid, I adore thee. A fragrant bee, one favor, it's where do ya dwell? Kind sir, forgive me, it's now I must leave you, for I hear the dumb sound of the factory bell. Now love is a thing that does rule every nation. Good morning, kind sir. My friends and relations who look round upon it. Besides, I'm a hard-working factory girl.
This is the new image of the secretary, I think, that seems particularly ironic and seems also to fit very much into the working woman strategy. Here she is punching her way to the top, and I have to read the text to give you the full pleasure of this. Our office was a mess. If you could find a label on anything, it was too worn and tattered to read. Nobody knew what was what or whose name was whose. So I took my dynamo typewriter and started punching. I punched labels for our filing cabinets and our binders, books, and phones, and so on. And the final reward was that the office looked great and everybody appreciated the new organization, especially my boss. Now, it seems to me that one of the more complicated things about this magazine, and this would be quite hard to find out, I think, is that I suspect a lot of women who are doing office work, secretarial work, are probably reading this magazine, perhaps even more than those who are already on the managerial level of corporate and executive positions. That, I think, would be a hard thing to find out, but I suspect that what's happening is that this magazine is appealing to people who need to be encouraged in their boring and alienating and often very hopeless jobs as secretaries to feel that there is a place for them at this executive level, and that there is a tradition and an increasing encouragement, and certainly an increasing appearance of this kind of working woman in magazine culture and in other cultures. I wanted to refer again to what I think, how a magazine like this has slighted what's been done among feminists for many years. This magazine will take instances of successful working women that have appeared in Hollywood film, and we'll talk about them as though they represent a fine old tradition where Katharine Hepburn or Rosalind Russell or Joan Crawford have been the successful working women. There is no attempt to understand what many feminist film critics have worked on for the last 10 or 15 years, which is that these successful women are always undermined by their position as working women, that it is always suspect that they have jobs, that they are often either murderous or in many ways comical when they have jobs, and that the resolution and closure for most of these films are that the woman has somehow been domesticated and has sort of subsided in her ambitiousness. The idea that an entire tradition of what I think is very important feminist work has been disregarded, and the sort of pure and most superficial aspect of these films is being dwelled on, again, just to somehow give encouragement to women who have apparently not thought about anything beyond the appearance of these so-called strong women in film. I think that that's one of many examples to support my point about how feminism has been ignored. Another not very ambivalent message in a book like this, magazine like this, is this dawn to midnight request to look good. This is something which, again, interestingly has been part of what women's magazines have suggested, that somehow you should look good at all times of day and be active and be beautiful and be making yourself gorgeous. But in this magazine, it becomes another aspect of a sort of compulsive work ethic that gets developed, so that looking good nonstop from dawn to midnight is part of this executive mentality, and this idea that there is never a slow point in your day, never a moment where you haven't considered what your appearance should be and what your audience is, and so on. It just seems to be a sort of accelerated version of what we've seen in so many women's magazines before this, about the look good mindset that you're supposed to have. In the last example that I wanted to talk about, where you're beginning to see a little bit of the backfiring, I think, of this lack of feminist analysis, is something like this. Working Your Way Up is the name of this column. A growing number of women have decided that it's strategy, not talent, that's an important factor in moving toward higher, better paid positions. And it goes on to say some of the special problems that are beginning to occur with this very mentality. Seeking assistance is not a weakness, but women sometimes perceive it that way. What I see in this argument is that, in fact, women have now adjusted and adapted to so many of those competitive values and those competitive ways of behaving that they have, in fact, taken on so many of the characteristics that the professional man has. Namely, you don't ask for help, you don't be vulnerable, you don't reveal that you are a dependent person. And that this is a very nice example, and I suspect there are many more, where there's a backfiring of that. I think if there was a true feminist kind of background to a journal like this, there would have been the opportunity to cite a great deal of literature that would have referred to the fact that women know something about community, and that women have learned something about cooperation, and that they can perhaps bring that into an executive position. I'm not arguing that they should stay out of executive positions. I'm arguing that they should be able to take with them into those positions the kinds of values that they have learned and that are in many ways real resistant values, values that in some ways challenge some of this mechanical, I'd say instrumental sort of system that exists in offices, where the sort of dog-eat-dog competitive, get your way to the top no matter what mentality is in fact very dehumanizing, and has been particularly dehumanizing to women from the start. I guess I have another minute. I was going to talk briefly about a piece that I think leaves some food for thought, that many of these executive women have been studied as having been their father's daughters. this is something which I'm not going to elaborate on except to say that there seems to be evidence that fathers, strong supportive fathers, have encouraged these women, and that in fact their relationships with their mothers may be very minimal or non-existent. I think it's an interesting question because once again there's a branch of feminism which has explored the relationships between mothers and daughters and the importance of that relationship and has put a great deal of emphasis on that kind of bonding and that kind of potential for understanding. And again, I think Working Woman is emphasizing, as it does on the cover of this magazine, is emphasizing that father-daughter bond is the bond that will take you into the business world and that will make possible. I'll just remind you, the set here is so interesting because the woman's stripes obviously appear to match the Venetian blinds, appear to match the father's gray, appear to be this wonderful, happy, incestuous couple. And I think that what's happening now is perhaps as a reaction to this kind of coupling, we've got something that is leaving out all of humanity and that is somehow an exaggerated caricature of everything that we don't need in this executive world.
Nit such mich wo die Myrten grünen, gefind's mich dorten nit mein Schatz. Wo Lebenswelken bei Maschinen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Nit such mich, wo die Vögel singen, gefind's mich dorten nit mein Schatz. Als Schlaf bin ich, wo Ketten klingen, dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Dorten ist mein Ruheplatz. Nit so